Welcome to New Rechts, or for our English speakers, New Right. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today I'm happy to introduce Robert Tyler. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
For those who don't know you, Robert Tyler is like a senior policy advisor at New Direction. It's the think tank of the ECR. It's the European Conservatives and Reformist Party in the European Parliament. He used to be an advisor for the ECR on counterterrorism, and he also focuses a lot on the situation in Central and Eastern Europe. And today we're going to talk about the political situation in Central and Eastern Europe, and specifically about the threat or potential threat of Russia. So let's, before we start going into there, why did you actually start working in policy? What made you go into this direction?
Honestly, it was by accident. I was 21 years old. I had just graduated a master's degree in security studies, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with myself. And then I saw that there were conservative members of the European Parliament from the UK advertising a role, looking for a policy advisor focused on foreign policy and counterterrorism. And I was thinking this is the perfect role for me. And so I applied for it, not thinking that it would go anywhere. And I wasn't even planning on leaving the UK. And then I was surprised when I got a call back saying, we'd like to hire you, we'd like you to come over and work on a special report that's being done by the European Parliament on counterterrorism. And so I moved to Brussels thinking I would be there on a 1-year contract. And 8 years later, I'm still here.
What has it been like, the transition to move from the UK to Brussels? What have been the biggest surprises for you to live abroad and live in this very different sphere, I would say, of politics?
Oddly enough, the biggest change, I think, has been a political one, which is obviously in the time that I've been here, we've had Brexit. And I remember on the night of Brexit, standing in front of the European Parliament as they were lowering the British flag from outside and sort of realizing, wow, this is really a moment in history. This is a big change that's taking place. And what I've seen since is a real political change inside the European Union. I feel that since the Brits have left, it's become a lot more protectionist. I think people don't have as much of an international outlook as they used to. And then in terms of just the culture of living in Brussels, it was a big change moving from the UK. In some ways, it's very similar, but in other places, it's quite different. Least of all, the biggest complaint I always have is about Sunday trading and shopping at the weekends. In the UK, we have a very liberal approach. In the continent, they take a more Christian approach.
That's a fair point. You already mentioned Brexit. I'm just curious. Like, how do you look back on it now? We're a few years further. You are in the center of the European politics. What are your thoughts on the Brexit? Looking back,
I still think it was the right choice for the United Kingdom. I think it made sense. The UK for 40 years had basically been an obstacle to what was the obvious will of the European Union, which is to keep moving towards further integration. And for 40 years, the UK was an obstacle saying, no, we don't want any of this. And so it was only natural that eventually it would leave. I'm glad that they did at the time that they did. But I think that ultimately what's happened since is there's been huge geopolitical shifts that I think ultimately have left Europe in a worse off position in some ways. I think, for example, if you talk about free trade, there have been no real moves towards expanding free trade since the UK left, because it was primarily a British initiative and an interest. I think the other thing that's changed is the dynamics within the European Council. Britain always used to be a kind of smokescreen for other countries. So countries in Central and Eastern Europe like Hungary and Poland or the Czech Republic were much more Eurosceptic. They didn't want this deeper integration into the European Union. They wanted to keep it as a loose federation. They wanted a Europe of nations. And Britain used to provide a sort of smokescreen by being the third largest country in the Union and basically saying, no, we don't want integration. And so these countries would be able to hide behind Britain on that. At the same time, when it came to kind of market liberalism, this idea of having free trade, less regulation, less centralization, sort of a more business-friendly approach, countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark used to hide behind the UK for cover on that. And now that the UK is gone, these countries are also struggling to say, hey, let's put the brakes on regulation. We don't want that anymore. I think to a lesser extent, the UK was also ahead on migration. They basically said, no, we don't want all these refugees coming to Europe. We want to have a controlled immigration system. And there were countries that were able to hide behind the UK on that. I think Italy has now come in and kind of filled that role as being the country that says, no, we don't want more migrants. We want a more managed approach.
That's a good point. That's an interesting take. I think in the Netherlands, indeed, for example, of course, we are like a Dutch platform, and the Netherlands is a very focused always as a country on the UK and in the United States. So in this sense, indeed, I think we feel it here as well. But let's get back to the point. So you started getting involved into the ECR. Why specifically the ECR?
I think fundamentally because it aligns with my values. I am in the UK a member of the Conservative Party. I would consider myself on the sort of classical liberal wing. I believe in decentralization. I believe in people having responsibility for their own lives. I don't believe in the sort of big government telling people what to do. I fundamentally believe in free trade over protectionism. I think, the more liberalist society in a sort of conservative sense, the better. And I'm also, conservative on things like foreign policy and believe in sort of preserving NATO and the transatlantic alliance. And I think the only group that really does all of those things is the ECR. In the EPP, you can kind of have some of the conservative values, but you would be lacking on trade and the transatlantic alliance. In the Patriots, they might be good at being Eurosceptic, but they're not very good on the transatlantic alliance or supporting NATO. So I think the ECR really is that kind of strong position that represents real conservatism, as you would understand it.
Vergeet de NOS en de NPO. Het is tijd voor Nieuw Rechts. De nieuwswebsite voor rechtsdenken Nederland.
That's a fair point, and I think we see also the ECR in some sense now seeing a lot of success. For example, you were talking about Italy, of course. So both nationally, I think, and in the European scale, they are actually having a lot of success. So I think that's good to see. I think because, of course, you said you were an advisor partly on counterterrorism. It's something that a lot of people are interested in because it sounds very exciting and people don't have a clear view of it. Can you maybe tell a little bit before we move to the Eastern European situation, what are some misconceptions that people have about counterterrorism?
I think ultimately the biggest misconception is people need to realize that it starts at home. A lot of the narrative of the last sort of 10 years of fighting terrorism has been on this idea that it's only refugees who are responsible, that it's only migrants who are coming in. Actually, if you look at a lot of the data, you'll realize it's not first-generation migrants, it's second or third-generation migrants who are the biggest problem. And ultimately, what we need to tackle is this idea that people aren't integrating into Western society properly. In the first generation, they might do everything they can to show, oh, well, we've become Dutch or we've become British or we've become French. But the kids are stuck in between two worlds and it leaves them vulnerable. They don't really realize where they belong. And it just leaves them completely susceptible to radicalization. And I think what needs to be done is we need to have a much stronger effort to prevent people from ending up radicalized in the first place. Most of counterterrorism policy isn't about putting up bollards, having screening to prevent, to check people going into buildings and so on. It's actually preventing people from becoming a terrorist in the first place.
And how do you think that we're doing in the European Union? You said, of course, there are quite some flaws. We see some attacks from, let's say, first, second, or third generation migrants, like you were saying. What are some of the strengths of the things that we're doing now, and what could we do to make sure that they integrate better?
I think there's a lot more work to be done. I think, as I said, if you look at surveys of second generation migrants asking whether they feel European, a lot of them don't feel that Europe represents them. And you can see that in the fabric of society, because it does also mean having proper representation. If you look at the European Parliament, for example, there are very few European Muslims represented. If you look at national parliaments, you don't see that many ethnic minorities represented. I think countries like the Netherlands and France and the United Kingdom do a better job of it than others. But even then, you have problems of breaking into communities and making sure that they're properly integrated. And I think what needs to be done is a more active effort. At the moment, we've been quite passive about it. There's been this assumption, okay, people will come, and they will just join society. No, it needs to be much more of an active approach. It needs to be about bringing them into society, talking to people about what it means to be a Dutch citizen, what it means to be a British citizen, what it means to be a German citizen, what are the values that underpin it, saying that there are certain things that are non-negotiable, like belief in a democratic and free society, belief in religious plurality, belief in free speech, and not shutting down debate. A lot of people, there's a kind of irony to this, which is that a lot of people who come to Europe are fleeing autocratic regimes. And yet when they arrive in Amsterdam or Birmingham or Paris, they end up in communities that are recreating those autocratic regimes that they've left. And we really need to do much more to break those down and bring people into the real liberal democratic societies that we live in.
Don't you think that, what I immediately think of is in the Netherlands, we have this progressive liberal party called D66, and they're famous for saying there's no such thing as Dutch culture. So maybe isn't also part of the problem that to actually have understanding what it means to be integrated in Western culture and Western societies, you actually need something to integrate into. Otherwise, it's understandable that people cannot integrate, right?
No, I completely agree. And I think a lot of harm has been done by this idea that we victim blame ourselves, basically, saying that the West is responsible for everything that's wrong in the world, that we should feel guilty for everything that's going on, that colonialism was ultimately a bad thing, that liberal democracy is evil, that our intervention and attempts to promote liberal democracy around the world are colonialism in the modern form. I think we need to move beyond that, because ultimately what we have as a society is better than what anyone else has. And I always use the very simple example of where would you rather live? A country where you can freely go out and have a coffee with your friends, listen to music and talk about politics? Or would you rather live in the unfree world where music is banned, where meeting in groups more than two is illegal, and where you can't discuss politics or religion or culture at all? And I think we need to basically start becoming better at making the case for the fact that the Western societies we live in are far better than the alternative.
I agree. I think most people here would actually agree with you. And maybe some of those that don't have never lived themselves in such a society. So it's very easy, of course, to talk about it when, for a lot of people, the consequences seem not that big, because it's just an intellectual argument without real consequences, when in reality, of course, it has real consequences.
No, exactly. And I think there's an interesting observation that I've made since I've been working in European politics, which is when it comes to defending Western values, the people who do it best are politicians from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, like the Czech Republic, countries like that, where they know what it's like to live in the alternative. A lot of these politicians grew up under communism. They know what it means to have shortages in supermarkets. They know what it means to be told what they can think and what they can say, that if you don't follow the party line or the cultural line, you don't get a good job. This is the alternative world that we defeated, and in some ways are now bringing back in our own societies.
That's a very good point. And now you talk about communism, of course. When people think of communism, they think of Russia. And of course, everything changed geopolitically in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We again have now a big scale war actually on the European continent. I think let's first start, before we go into what this means. Let's just start. Why do you think actually that Russia invaded Ukraine?
I think there's a couple of underlying reasons, and they're not easy to explain, but I'll try and break them down a bit. The first is to understand that these notions of realpolitik, of countries as rational actors, as countries always acting in their rational self-interest, that this whole notion is false, and basing foreign policy on it doesn't work. Now, the reason I say that is because the reason Russia invaded Ukraine was not rational. It was because they were pursuing something fundamentally untangible and irrational, which was their national pride. Deep embedded in the Russian political culture and the Russian psyche is this idea of Russian empire and of a lost empire, and they want to come back to it. And they're willing to do that at any cost possible. So losing hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers on a front line in order to reclaim a former empire isn't something that bothers them. So one of the reasons they did go into Ukraine, and one of the reasons why they took Crimea, and the reasons they've invaded Georgia and intervened in places like Kazakhstan in the past, is because they have this belief that they need to roll back the clock and go back to this view of a world which is based on Russian imperial hegemony. This idea that they are the strongest country, that they are unthreatened, that they have land in between them and the West that protects them as a buffer zone. So that's one reason why they went in, was because they wanted to reassert an old world order in which Russia was a hegemon, and like the old Russian Empire or like the Soviet Union. If you listen to the rhetoric out of the Kremlin, they always talk about the biggest mistake of the last 50 years being the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Well, I think if you talk to Estonians, Latvians, Poles, and so on about that, they would have a different argument. They would say that the best thing that happened was they got their independence back. So Russia is fundamentally driven by this, and it's described in academic circles as what we call an ontological security, this idea that Russia has a view of itself that is threatened, and therefore it needs to pursue a foreign policy to restore its own image of itself. That's one thing. The second point is Russia, or the Russian people, feel like they're heading towards a demographic cliff edge. The population in Russia is, like in a lot of the world, declining. But rather than looking to migration as a solution, Russia wanted to ensure that it was only Russian people coming in. So how did they do that? Well, in the first instance, they made lots of incentives, and they tried to encourage people to have more children. And it didn't really work. The birth rate didn't go up. The population continued to stagnate. So in the second instance, they started pursuing policies of trying to encourage ethnic Russians abroad to move back by offering tax incentives, by offering them sort of, I think in some cases, direct payments for moving back, giving them property, things like that. Again, not that many Russians moved. So the third option that they had has been to repatriate by force what they see as old Russians. Mm-hmm. And so they've started targeting countries that have large ethnic Russian minorities in a bid to try and bring them back into the population. Now, the evidence for that is obvious. If you look at what's happened in the occupied territories in Ukraine, they have forcibly deported hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians into Russia, given them Russian passports, put them through re-education programs where they've been forced to learn Russian culture and integrate into Russian society. And it's not the first time they've done this. In the winter of 2021-2022, so around December 21, January 22, there was a insurrection in Kazakhstan, and Russia sent troops to intervene. At the same time that they did that, and this is well documented but underreported, they extracted around 500,000 ethnic Russians from northern Kazakhstan and redistributed them across the Russian Federation. So they've got this active policy of trying to get back Russians wherever they are in the world in order to boost the numbers at home.
That's, I guess, a lot of good things for people to understand. I think, like you said yourself, a lot of this is not so much unknown in an academic sense, but unknown by the public. Let me try to challenge you a little bit with some of the arguments that, let's say, people that have a different view might have. I think some people say that NATO provoked this invasion because, contrary to the agreement, they moved slowly towards the east as an alliance, and the influence in Ukraine as the buffer zone between Russia increased, and therefore Russia is afraid that either regime change would be tried also in Russia, or that they militarily at least would be threatened by NATO. How would you respond to this quite common response?
I think the real reply to that is that Russia expands, NATO enlarges. And what I mean by that is that NATO is a voluntary association of nations. It's the right of any country in the North Atlantic sphere to choose to join NATO if it wants to. It's not, no one is forced to join NATO. Nobody told the Czech Republic and Poland, you have to join it. They volunteered to. And the reason is because NATO was there to protect its member states from external attack during the Cold War, whilst the Warsaw Pact was there to prevent any of its member states from leaving. And this mentality carried on after the Cold War. NATO has always been there to protect the external borders of its members. When countries in the 90s like Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary quite naturally said, look, we've broken off from communism, we want to be free again, we want to rejoin the West, as the Czech author Milan Kundera described it. When they rejoined the West, part of that was, we need to make sure that we can never fall back into Russia's sphere again. And their way of doing that was basically by joining NATO. If there was any truth to Russia's claim that it was NATO expansion that was the threat, they would have invaded Finland or Sweden at the same time. Both countries have doubled the length of NATO's border with Russia in the last 2 years with no response. So I think that the NATO argument is basically an argument of convenience. And then, of course, there's the claim that Russia was told that NATO would never enlarge. When you talk to people from the end of the Reagan administration to the Bush administration to the Clinton administration, there's no evidence that anyone had that conversation. People didn't tell Russia that NATO wouldn't enlarge. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The Russians were quite happy. At one point, they even asked to join NATO as an option. Around the time of 9/11, they wanted to join NATO. But they set it up in a way that they were doomed to fail anyway, because they demanded that they be invited. No country gets invited to NATO. Countries have to apply to become members of NATO.
That's a very good point, but still we see that, like, let's say if you look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, that we have, let's say, one dominant view in the West, but a lot of countries in the world don't have this view necessarily. If you look, for example, at sanctions, most countries actually do not sanction Russia. I think approximately 16% of the world population and the countries they represent actually sanction Russia. So there is also this other view that's, let's say, less positive about the Western attitude. Why do you think that people actually don't sanction Russia? And do you think there's any fair criticism in all these other countries that are skeptical of the Western approach towards Russia?
For that, you need to zoom out a step. So we're looking primarily at the European conflict first. When you zoom out, you need to look at the fact that whether we like it or not, we're locked in a new Cold War. That on one side, you've got the United States, the European Union, NATO, Australia, Japan, South Korea, countries like that, the democratic world, the free world, on one side. Then on the other, you have the unfree world, what sometimes people call the axis of evil and so on. And that's that Russia doesn't act alone. If you look at the way Russia has been fighting in Ukraine, it has used drones manufactured in Iran, ammunition manufactured in China, and troops now from North Korea fighting on the ground in Ukraine. What I mean by that is that when you look at a geopolitical framework, these countries are all cooperating with each other. And when it comes to policies like sanctions or votes at the United Nations or votes at other international level organizations, they're coordinating with each other. So what's going on? Well, China for the last 2 decades has been going around the global south offering competitive free trade agreements to developing countries. They've offered to buy and build infrastructure. They've built ports in Sri Lanka. They've built railways in Africa. The headquarters of the African Union was built by the Chinese. In Latin America, they're building all sorts of infrastructure. The reason all of that exists is to buy soft power. Because once you start buying these things and building these things for countries, they're more likely to support your position at places like the United Nations. And what's basically been going on over the last 3 years is China has been calling in favors. They've been going around the global south to countries that they've basically bought and saying, look, don't sanction Russia. And remember, we built you a new railway. We built you a new highway. We gave you a trade agreement. And a big part of that is down to the failure of the West. The European Union for far too long has been attaching conditionality to trade. We've been basically going around and lecturing countries in the global south. For example, there's no free trade agreement with most of Africa. There's no free trade agreement with Latin America. We've only just managed to get one through with our allies in Australia and Canada. And then countries like India are completely ignored. And it's because we come in with this lecturing mentality that if you don't do what we say on environmental standards, you don't get a free trade agreement. China, on the other hand, has been going around and buying votes at the United Nations by saying, here's a whole load of money, here's a trade agreement, and by the way, you do what we say. And there was a very good example of this just last week, where the UN Security Council had a Russian-led motion on fighting neo-Nazis, which is obviously their way of framing the war in Ukraine. And it passed. Why? Because Europe was completely outvoted. And it was by countries like Congo. It was by countries like Fiji. It was by countries that we don't even think about, that we don't even have foreign policies towards, because the Chinese and the Russians got there first to tell them, hey, there might be a bit more foreign aid coming your way if you vote our way.
And do you see some awareness, for example, within the European Union or broader within the US to change this around and actually start thinking more like smartly, I would say, in this geopolitical way of the world?
I sadly don't think so. And the reason why not is because it's inconvenient for a lot of people still. If you talk to people working in the External Action Service in Brussels or working in the foreign ministries in the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, they don't want to change things. They don't want to shape policy. They would rather keep things the way they are. And then when you get to countries like Germany and France, there's business interests. They don't want to disrupt trade. They don't want to upset big business by sanctioning countries like China and Russia. And there's no strategic thinking. I think what we're missing is, in effect, our Cold Warrior class. During the Cold War, you had people like the Dulles brothers in the United States. You had Kennan, who was the author of a lot of Cold War foreign policy. There's no modern equivalent to Henry Kissinger. No, there's no one at the top level really thinking about these things. Now, it's very possible that the Trump administration, when it comes in January, will bring in people like that. But in Europe, it's completely missing.
And what do you think, if you zoom in a little bit again to, let's say, normal people just living their lives either in UK, in the Netherlands, France, what's the impact on them of the failure of European leadership to actually think about these things?
It's catastrophic, and it'll be reflected in all sorts of different ways, from the cost of living to the security of our own homes to the security of our own being. You just need to take an example of the disruption to trade that we saw in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait off the coast of Yemen. The way that the Houthis, sponsored by Iran, have been able to fire missiles at trading vessels traveling through the Suez Canal has already had an inflationary impact. We can see what the cost of those delays in shipping can do to our societies. If you take another example, the security of our personal devices, the security of our society. Everyone has a smartphone. Those smartphones are manufactured in China. How do we know that we're not inadvertently sending all of our private and personal data to the opposition? If you want the really sort of worst example of it, it would be TikTok. We're allowing teenagers in our societies to download an app that is pushing anti-Western propaganda. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the algorithm in the West is pushing pro-Palestinian narratives, anti-Ukrainian narratives. You can't post anything critical of China on the platform. And it's being fed directly to our kids. Meanwhile, in China itself, kids are only allowed to access TikTok for 30 minutes a day. And I think there was a US Congressman, Mike Gallagher, who chaired the committee investigating the Chinese Communist Party. He referred to it as digital fentanyl. And that's basically where we are with all this. And there are other places we can see this impact of the axis of evil. The weaponization of migration, for example. When you look at the Russian Wagner Group's missions in the South Sahara, they are there to destabilize these countries. And where do the people fleeing those conflicts go? They move north. They're coming to Europe. They're arriving off the coast of Spain. They're arriving off the coast of Italy. This is the weaponization of migration. In the most extreme cases, we've seen Russia itself flying migrants from the Middle East and pushing them towards the Finnish border, towards the Latvian border, towards the Polish border, and basically importing migrants as a weapon.
And what can What can European citizens who are maybe looking at this, they're seeing they're getting less control over their lives, they see tension rising, inflation, they see a lot of things where they're not as optimistic as maybe they were a few decades ago. What can people do themselves to change this around, and what can people hope for?
I think there's a need to educate themselves, because I think one of the things I worry about is that the mainstream hasn't woken up to this threat, and it's quite a big problem that people don't question enough the news sources they're being given, which means that quite often they're being fed disinformation that can at times come from Russia and China itself. And I think the other thing we need to start doing is to basically be prouder of our own identity and be prouder of the West. As I said earlier, we need to stop apologizing for ourselves and admit that actually the Western way of life is much better than the alternative, and that we should be voting for politicians who are willing to stand by that message. I think one of the things we need is a new answer to Ronald Reagan, to Margaret Thatcher, to John Paul II, to have these kind of leaders who are willing to stand up for the West as a bloc, not just as their own nation.
I think that's an inspiring message. Let's hope that we can see some of the fruits of that. I want to go quickly back to Ukraine, of course, because we're still in this conflict and it's happening every day. People are dying every day. The impact is felt every day. From my understanding, Ukraine is having a hard time militarily as well, but also in terms of support. At this point, what does realistically a Ukraine victory look like, actually?
I think at this point, a Ukrainian victory is a return to the borders that existed before the conflict. Whether that's with or without Crimea, I'm not sure yet. But at the very least, it needs to be that they reaffirm the borders that were internationally recognized by the Budapest Memorandum in the 1990s. That narrative is perhaps shifting. I mean, over the weekend, we heard some incoming people from the Trump administration saying that perhaps Ukraine will have to make concessions on Crimea. We'll have to see how the Ukrainian government responds to that. But ultimately, Ukrainian victory needs to be pushing back Russia to its own borders. But the cost of not achieving that is even greater. There was a study by the Kiel Institute last week that was published that basically estimated that the cost of Ukraine losing would be 3 times as much of the cost of the current situation, the current conflict.
Why would that cost be 3 times higher?
Basically on the basis of Russia being given the opportunity to advance in other places, the cost of managing what would be an incredible number of refugees fleeing Ukraine after loss, the cost to international trade through the region, the cost of grain not being sent to the global south, causing global famine. There's all sorts of knock-on effects that we don't think about.
And do you think that that it's possible actually to push back the Russians towards the border? Because so far they're slowly but surely advancing a little bit on the front. I don't see any of this happening at the moment.
They need to be given the tools to actually do it and to actually win. I think one of the biggest problems we've seen since the beginning of the conflict is a hesitancy from the West to actually give them what they need to win and to actually allow them to use the weapons properly. So one of the big criticisms has been that, they've been using what are offensive weapons for defensive purposes because the West hasn't given them the backing to use them for offensive purposes. So a lot of these main battle tanks, the Leopards, the Challengers, the Abrams that they've been given have been dug into positions, which makes them useless. These are weapons that are supposed to advance across a battlefield. Instead, they've been told by the West, you can have them, but you can't use them properly, or we won't support you using them properly. If they had been given the tools to actually secure, advances, they would be doing much better. Likewise, with these long-range missiles like the Taurus system and so on, they've been told, well, you can't fire deep into Russia. Well, what's the point of that? That's the purpose of these weapons. We're supposed to be able to hit Russian airfields deep inside the country. We're supposed to be able to hit Russian military bases inside the country. Because, and it shows in a way that Russia has better allies than Ukraine does. Because when Iran started shipping missiles and drones to Russia, it didn't tell them, well, you can have them, but just don't fire them at any civilian buildings. No, they basically said, use them for whatever purposes you want. And as a result, the Russian regime is committing all sorts of atrocities against the civilian population with Iranian-built weapons. So we basically have to give Ukraine what it needs to win rather than what it needs to survive.
And I think one of the arguments against this that people give a lot is that, Russia is, first of all, a nuclear power. So that might be a threat. And additionally, we are escalating this war. So how can, if you keep escalating this war, how does actually peace look like? I think those are two arguments that I hear a lot towards what you're saying. How would you respond to that?
On the point of escalation, is it not an escalation for Russia to have brought 6,000 Cuban volunteers to fight on the front line? Is it not an escalation for them to have brought 10,000 North Koreans to fight on the front line? Is it not an escalation for them to have been hitting civilian targets with Iranian-built weapons? Is it not already an escalation for Russia to have been deploying more long-range strategic weapons in the region? Is it not an escalation that they've been hitting civilian infrastructure like nuclear power plants, which pose a risk to the whole of Europe? The escalation argument isn't one-sided. Russia has been escalating and escalating and escalating, and we've done nothing in response. I think they realize that they can get away with doing that because we're so afraid of this word escalation. When it comes to the nuclear weapons point, I don't think they're willing to do it because they know that it goes the other way. It's a two-way system, that if they fire a nuclear weapon, what's to stop America or Britain or France from firing one the other direction?
The argument has been that if they use what they call tactical nuclear weapons, so smaller ones inside Ukraine, if they feel like they're going to lose this war, that for the West, like let's be honest, nobody in their right mind wants a nuclear war. Like they're only losers at that point. So I think in this sense, you could say Russia, at least in some degree, is more rational than, let's say, some Hamas people who think they will go to heaven with 40 virgins. With those people, you cannot have a rational argument. With Russia, you can somewhat have a rational argument. But still, people are afraid that the risk of a nuclear war is at least something to take into account when assessing the risk of escalating. But I agree with you. Of course, Russia is also to blame for this.
No, I mean, Russia always measures these things. The Kremlin regime is incredibly calculating. They've taken these issues into account, which is why they realize what they can get away with. And it's because they exploit the fear that we have of nuclear war, which is why they're able to keep advancing and advancing and advancing. One of the things I would expect, actually, is from a sort of more maverick leader with strategic ambiguity like Trump, if he were to turn around and say tomorrow, well, I might do it, I think the Russians would start backing off because they're as afraid of nuclear war as we are, which is why they haven't done it. If they were going to do it, they would have done it already.
You mentioned Trump. Of course, Trump in his campaign famously said, I will fix this war within 24 hours. And I think he's been hinting a lot at the fact that maybe, like you said yourself already, Ukraine needs to give up some territory. What do you think that the effect actually will be, like when he gets into office?
I mean, part of that depends on the administration he has around him. Overnight, we heard that Marco Rubio is likely to be the Secretary of State. He's appointed his national security advisor, is a congressman. Both of them are incredibly hawkish on Ukraine. And I think if he's appointing people like that to top jobs, it shows that he is taking the Ukraine issue seriously. And if he's appointing them to these jobs, it also shows that he's going to listen to them. So what I would expect in the first 24 hours is there will be two phone calls. The first one will be to the Kremlin, and he'll talk to the Russian president, and he will tell them, you need to back off. We need to end this war now, which I would imagine the Kremlin won't listen to. In which case there would be a second phone call, which would be to Zelensky, which would be to say, right, we're going to give you whatever it takes. End this as quickly as possible, because I don't want to be dealing with this in a year's time. And that has been Trump's approach in the past. Remember, he dealt with Iran quite effectively in the same way by providing the strategic ambiguity, by saying, if you hit Israel, I will give Israel everything it needs to win. And he's going to do the same, I think, for Taiwan. He's going to do the same for Ukraine. He'll do the same in other places where he feels the West is challenged. Because one of the things that what he would be able to do is he'd be able to point out and say, look, there were no new wars when I was president the first time. And then you had Biden and Harris, who caused all of this turmoil in the world, and now I've fixed it.
That it would be great if we can move away from these conflicts for sure. The last point I want to ask about Ukraine, of course, one of the voices here also a lot is that we need to negotiate more with the Russians and talk together with them for long-term peace. We're now talking about, I guess, the military option, but do you also think there is room to maybe negotiate more with Russia in getting to a point of what we could consider a victory?
I think it's harder to secure a victory at the negotiating table, least of all because whatever happens, Russia will be able to turn it around and make it look like a victory for them and a loss for the West. Especially this idea of if the conflict were just to freeze on current lines, well, they'd be able to turn around and say to their people, well, look, we captured all this territory. It's the same size as all three Baltic states combined. This is now Russia. We've secured a victory. Look at how weak the West is. There's no way of spinning it and saying, well, we stopped the conflict. It would just be a defeat. It would basically be appeasement again. Mm-hmm. The second problem with that is the question of whether we think that Russia would actually stick to an agreement once it struck one. And history tells us that it probably wouldn't. If you go back to the old Minsk agreements back in 2016-17, you can see there that Merkel, Hollande, and Obama tried to negotiate with the Kremlin to create a ceasefire. And they had to do it twice because in both cases, the ceasefire was broken within 24 hours of it being agreed. And there's nothing to say that that wouldn't happen again.
That's a fair point. Let's hope that in the upcoming months and years, we can look back on, let's say, more peaceful Europe. I guess we already talked about that Ukraine is maybe the most volatile at the moment because there are also other countries. One of them that has been in the news lately a lot is Moldova. That is, I guess, let's say, influenced by Russia, if you want to put it mildly. Why do you think that Russia is even interested in influencing Moldova?
It goes back to what I said before about this imperial aspiration of Russia. It's this idea that they want to restore their old empire. Moldova itself is probably one of the worst victims of Soviet occupation, in the sense that they absolutely reshaped the nature of the country. Because historically, Moldova was a part of Romania. Moldavia, today, half of the region is still part of Romania. The people who lived there spoke Romanian. They identified as Romanian. They were members of the Romanian Orthodox Church. The list goes on. Under Soviet occupation, a large number of ethnic Russians were moved in, who administered the country, who started teaching the Romanians living there, no, you're not Romanian, actually. You're something else. You're called Moldovans. And you speak the Moldovan language, and you belong to the Moldovan Orthodox Church, which is, by the way, a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And they completely reshaped the face of the country. And so when they got independence in the 1990s, they were kind of stranded. They were left behind because Moldova was one of the few bits that said, well, actually, maybe we should rejoin the Russian Federation in some form because of this strong number of ethnic Russians living there. So Russia has always asserted a strong degree of influence over the region, and it's forced the country to be stuck in a no man's land in between the West and the East. It never got to develop properly. It has the same population as Estonia. It got independence at the same time as Estonia, but because of this meddling by Russia, it never got to develop in the same way. Estonia has become one of the fastest growing economies in the EU. It's one of the most stable and reliable countries. Moldova is one of the most corrupt and politically backwards countries. So Russia has been trying everything it can to hold it back, partly because it wants it within its sphere of influence, and partly because, again, it goes back to this idea of soft power. It can use Moldova as a proxy for other purposes.
That's a fair point. And I think we are seeing this now. Of course, we just had elections where, let's say, the pro-Western party, they barely won. But there are many accusations of Russian interference. What are your thoughts on these accusations that we've been seeing?
It's the continuation of a long-running saga. So a few years ago, Maya Sandu, who's the pro-Western president of the country, won election, and she won a big parliamentary majority. And obviously, this was against expectations. She ran a very good campaign where she got lots of popular support. And then she was able to take Moldova from being one of the most backwards countries to one of the fastest developing ones. and talking about EU membership, NATO membership, and being part of the West again, closer ties to Romania and all this. Obviously, Russia was infuriated by this, and they started pouring everything they could into the Russian community in Moldova. And that includes basically spreading disinformation at various stages. So during the COVID pandemic, there was lots of Russian disinformation claiming that the vaccine was there to target ethnic Russians so that they wouldn't get vaccinated and so they would hold protests against the government. Then when the war in Ukraine started, ethnic Russians started protesting against the pro-Ukrainian stance of the government. And that included at one point almost staging a coup 2 years ago in the country, which forced, it was quite dramatic because effectively the government was forced to shut the major airport and all access to the country whilst they were dealing with the fact that a huge number of Russians had flown into the country to stoke up anger and hatred. And they basically protested outside the parliament and threatened to storm the parliament. And they threatened to storm the presidential administration. Eventually it was put down. It later materialized that there had been links to the Wagner group within those protests. And there were groups like Bellingcat that did photo analysis and looked at some of the people in the protests and found that they weren't Moldovan at all, but these were Russians who had been flown in to cause trouble. Then last year they had local elections, which were fundamentally rigged. It was estimated that the Russian government had spent several $100 million on disinformation campaigns to promote pro-Russian parties in the local elections, and they almost won. And then the same happened again this year with the referendum. Polling in April suggested that around 65% of the Moldovan public wanted to join the EU and NATO. And instead, it ended up being 50.1% in favour because of how much meddling had taken place in the intervening months. And that was without the West doing anything to support the pro-European side.
Yes, I guess we are seeing that a lot is happening here. Why do you think that, like, let's say, normal European citizens should care? Because for one of the things I see a lot is people say, okay, it's happening there. We have enough on our plate. We can barely pay the rent. We have already enough conflicts going on in the world. Whatever happening in Moldova, maybe it's not as fair with Russia interfering there, but maybe let's just not focus on it because there's too much going on. How would you respond to this kind of attitude?
I'd respond to it by saying, imagine you lined up a whole load of dominoes and toppled one. The idea of the domino effect is still very much valid in the world today, because if they feel as though they can get away with doing something like that in a small country like Moldova, which has a large ethnic Russian population, what's to say that they don't start doing that in EU member states or NATO member states that have large Russian populations? Everything that they're testing in Moldova is what they then want to try and do in Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia. It's everything that they want to try doing in countries that are less integrated, like Bulgaria or Romania. They're willing to play these games. And if you look at the instability, for example, in a country like Bulgaria today, they've had 7 elections in 5 years, and part of that is because the Russians are supporting the left and the far right in Bulgaria, basically giving them help so that they can keep causing chaos and keep ending up with indecisive election results. So the more you ignore something happening on your neighborhood, on your doorstep, the more likely it is that something's going to start happening in your, closer to home, that people start meddling. And again, we can see that because if you look over the last summer, there has been a wave of Russian aggression inside Europe. Things like vandalism at military bases, sabotage on public infrastructure. In the UK, we've seen examples of this in the Czech Republic, in Germany, in France. Intelligence agency after intelligence agency is coming out with reports saying Russia was responsible for vandalism or infrastructure damage. If they think they can get away with it in one place, they think they can get away with it everywhere.
And do you think there's actually something the European Union can do to change the situation in Moldova?
Yes, it needs to speak up for itself. I think one of the most ridiculous things that it did was stay quiet. There's this whole idea of, we play fair and we do things by the book and, we won't interfere in someone's internal politics. That's all well and good, except that our adversaries are doing just that. They are funneling money to their guys. They are supporting their guys. They are giving them everything they need to win. Whereas we're not doing that for our people. And it doesn't even have to be that we give them money. It doesn't even have to be that we use government resources. It just has to be, for example, I don't know, the foreign minister of the Czech Republic flying to Moldova ahead of the election and saying, hey, isn't it nice that this person is running on a pro-European platform? It'd be even nicer if we got you guys into the European Union. There's soft power things that we can do, but we don't. I think we're sort of too afraid of our own shadow in that regard.
Fair point. I want to move to the last country I would like to discuss with you, and that's Georgia. You could say there's another country that has been like the victim of Russian aggression. Like they got it invaded 16 years ago. But before we dive into it, maybe you can explain a little bit for people that don't know so much about the conflict. Why does it exist and why does it matter?
It's another one of those situations where basically Russia set the Soviet Union up with a whole load of booby traps that if it ever collapsed would spring. And that was basically done by moving populations around so that there were large enough minorities that they could cause a problem. So as I've mentioned before, Moldova and the Baltic states got given ethnic Russians. Ukraine got given a whole load of ethnic Russians to create a sizable minority. The same happened in Georgia. In the provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, you have large numbers of ethnic Russians. Now, during the 1990s, when Georgia declared independence, there was a short war between Russia and Georgia, which Georgia ultimately won. And it held on to South Ossetia and Abkhazia as integral parts of the country. In 2008, when the West was distracted by US presidential elections and distracted by other events, Russia did it again. They invaded, and this time they managed to get tanks to the outskirts of the capital, Tbilisi, and forced the Georgians to surrender South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And what effectively happened is that Georgia gave up its territory to Russia. These states now live in limbo. They're not part of the Russian Federation, but they're not part of Georgia either. And basically, they've left Georgia without 25% of its territory.
That's a very intense situation. And now we see that was not enough, of course. We see the same situation with Moldova with accusations of election interference also happening. What do you think is like the future of this conflict? Of course, that's not talked a lot about. Of course, with Ukraine happening, we see no attention for Georgia. What do you think are the prospects of moving forward with it?
I think that ultimately society is at a standstill in Georgia. Every single night now there have been enormous protests with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets of Tbilisi protesting against what they see as fraudulent elections. A lot of the external exit polling had suggested by third country polling companies had predicted that the Georgian Dream Party would lose. And what they did was they gave ethnic minorities double ballots. They took people's identity cards away so they couldn't vote. They stuffed ballot papers into the polling booth. Lots of election observers have come back and talked about the fraud that was committed during the election, during the voting process itself. Before the voting even took place, the party is called Georgian Dream. It's a pro-Russian party. They have been in power now since 2012, but they've been using their position in government to basically promote their own position. So they took over all of the media stations, they established a government communications agency, and all of these things are only there to promote the interest of the Georgian Dream Party and the very wealthy oligarch who's in charge of it. I think the country is going to end up in a kind of stalemate. But once again, this is a crisis of our own making. What happened is that after the invasion in 2008, the West started pouring all sorts of resources into helping the Georgian people. But they didn't realize that policy needed to change when the government changed. And as a result, European taxpayer money has been used on a government communications agency that has effectively been promoting anti-Western foreign policy and promoting anti-Western positions inside the country. And it's happening because no one at a European level or at a national government level thought to look at the policy and say, hey, wait a minute, is it right that Dutch taxpayer money is being used on Russian propaganda? Perhaps we need to pull the plug on this project. But because it was too inconvenient for the people who have stakes in it, it hasn't happened.
I guess that's something that people should realize. People should know that this is happening. I really want to thank you. I think you got a lot of clear information across to people that want to be well informed on this topic. If people want to follow you or your work, where could they do it?
They can find me at RG Tyler on Twitter, or they can follow me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you also for our listeners and our readers of New Rechts or New Right. And see you in the next one.
Thank you.